If you would like to support the podcast, you can click the Buy Us a Coffee link on our show notes or on our website. Your support helps us keep the podcast going, and we appreciate each of our listeners so much.
You can also rate and review us on Apple and Spotify. Follow us on social media, and don't forget to tell your friends and family about us. I'm Darlene.
And I'm Melody.
This is Hard Times and True Crimes.
Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And let us not grow weary while doing good. For in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. Galatians chapter 6, verse 7 through 10.
I'm Darlene.
I'm Melody.
This is Hard Times and True Crimes. Even though this isn't our first episode of the new year, do you have any resolutions for 2024?
Well, I don't call them resolutions. That sounds very committal. I just say goals. I do have a few, one of them being I am trying to make sure I get more protein. I used to be really good about it, and then I've just gradually slipped more and more, and then I realized I'm not getting nearly enough protein. So my goal is to be really diligent about doing that daily.
Oh, you got your shake there too.
Yeah, that's why I'm drinking a protein shake today.
Okay. Yeah, I've just ate like garbage, I feel like, since before Thanksgiving, actually. So I'm just trying to clean up my diet. Also, you're probably like, please don't tell me this again, but I'm really going to start working out.
Yeah, I think that's a good goal. And I'm not going to, you've been working out haven't you, prior to that? Yeah.
Yeah, but like walk in and that kind of thing. But I'm going to get more serious about it, go to the gym. Also, I want to declutter my house. Yeah. I'm going to give myself 3 months to do that.
Okay, good job.
So yeah.
Are you telling that publicly so we can all hold you accountable?
Yes, actually.
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
And I want to read my Bible.
Oh, that's good. I did that one last year, so now I'm just looking for a new study.
Well, that's awesome. Okay, so I'm going to jump right into today's episode.
Okay.
In 1921, 4 young men, all in their early 20s, came together and made a plan to rob the Oakdale Bank and Trust in Oakdale, Tennessee.
Okay.
So one of the men, his name was Otto Stevens, told the others that there was $75,000 up for grabs. They'd each get almost $19,000, and in 1921,
pretty
that
good
went a
chunk
long
of
way.
change.
Yes. So on May 30th, 1921, the time came to put their plans into action. 2 of the 4 men, Charles Petrie and John McClure, spent the day in Knoxville looking for a taxi that would make a good getaway car. After hunting around town late into the afternoon, on Depot Street, they spotted just the right vehicle, a high-powered Chandler 6.
So they're going to steal the vehicle?
Yeah, but they go about it like in a different way.
Okay.
It's not like just stealing it outright. This particular vehicle they chose because not only was it a large 7-passenger sedan with a very powerful motor, according to advertisements from the time, this model had been tested and traveled 2,000 miles from Mexico to British Columbia without stopping. But seeing how that's impossible even by today's standards, I doubt the validity of those claims. But anyway.
But marketing, you know.
Another claim from the time was that a man named Ralph Milford won a contest in a Chandler 6 called the Climb to Clouds, which was a hill climb in Mount Washington, New Hampshire.
Obviously, it was well known to be a good car.
It was, and it did have a very powerful motor, and so they felt like if they needed to make their escape, they'd be able to go through some different terrain, and they'd be all set.
They could trust this for the getaway car.
Exactly. So 26-year-old Andrew Crumley was the unlucky driver of the taxi who worked for a service there in Knoxville. He had been standing outside the Chandler Six when two well-dressed young men approached him, asking what he charged by the hour. Andrew told the men that he charged $3 an hour in the city and $3.50 an hour on country roads. So they asked if they could hire him to take them to Clinton, where they could catch a train to their home in Oakdale. They explained that they'd missed the Knoxville train to Oakdale, so they just wanted him to take them as far as Clinton. Nowadays, the drive from Knoxville to Clinton would take just a little over 20 minutes, but back then it would have taken quite a bit longer with slower automobiles and no streetlights, paved roads, just
All
being
of that.
far and few between. But Andrew did agree to drive them. As they started out, Andrew told the two that he was going to make a quick stop to his mother-in-law's boarding house where he actually lived because his best friend, George Lewis, also lived there. And he went in and asked George if he'd mind riding along with him so that he'd have some company that evening on the way back home.
Sure.
George agreed, and on the way to Clinton, everybody was friendly. Andrew and George, they were talking up a storm in the front seats, while Petrie and McClure were carrying on a conversation in the back. They probably wouldn't have been able to have too much of a conversation from the front to the back seat because vehicles were very loud.
Yeah.
But every once in a while, they would talk back and forth from the front to the back seat. Once they got to Clinton, Andrew was expecting to drop Petrie and McClure off at the train station, but they directed him to a boarding house and asked him to wait there for a minute. The two went inside, and then two more men came out, Otto Stevens and Tom Christmas. Now there were 4 in total, and they got into Andrew's car. One of the men was carrying a suitcase, and they asked if Andrew could go ahead and take them about 10 miles past Clinton all the way to one of their homes. Andrew was a little suspicious when he saw that suitcase. He was very leery about anything illegal, and he wondered if there might be liquor in that suitcase.
Okay.
He was wondering, are these guys trying to use my taxi to run liquor? Prohibition had just started the year before, and the fine for selling bootlegged whiskey was up to $5,000, or even up to a year in prison, if not both.
Wow, that's pretty steep.
He was a young family man. Andrew, like I said, he was only 26 years old himself. He had a wife and a new baby at home, and he just wanted to work an honest job and support his family. In fact, this taxi service was his second job. He was a painter by day, and then by night he drove a taxi. He told him, he said, look, if this has anything to do with whiskey, I do not want any part of it. If that's what's going on, then I'm going to have to let y'all out right here. And the men were like, no, you got us all wrong. We're not criminals. We're just trying to get home. Our friends are going with us, and that's why we have the suitcase. It's just a travel bag. And that made sense. He agreed to go ahead and take him on home then, because, he'd get some more money. Before long, everybody was laughing and cutting up and joking, and this totally put Andrew's mind at ease.
Quick question.
Uh-huh.
Is Andrew's friend still in the car too?
Yes.
So there are 6 of them now.
There are 6 of them in the vehicle. Yep. So there are 4 in the back, 2 in the front. As they were driving, one of the men asked Andrew to pull over, and so he did. They were on now a country road. Petrie, the youngest looking of the bunch, he got out of the car and yelled back to the others, "Is this the place?" And they yelled back, "No, this isn't it." And Andrews really didn't think nothing of it. He just figured they were looking for a road that led to the house they were going to. Petrie got back in the car, and Andrews kept on driving. And a few minutes later, one of the men yelled out, "Here, pull over here." When Andrew pulled over and stopped the vehicle, he thought to himself, this place is a really secluded area. And suddenly he heard somebody yell out, "Get your hands up."
Oh, no.
He thought for sure, oh my gosh, this is a deputy sheriff, and these guys had in fact been using him to run moonshine.
Oh, that's what his thought was.
Yes, and he was irritated, ready to try his best to explain himself and get out of this mess. But he threw his hands up and turned his head around to talk to the authorities, and that's when he realized that it was his passengers who had this big gun pointed right at his and George's heads. 2 of the young men held guns to them. 2 others were taking stuff out of their pocket. They took a police gazette out of George's pocket, which was basically a men's lifestyle magazine in the 20s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then from Andrew, they took a New Testament Bible, his Army discharge papers, his taxi ID, and several letters. When Petrie saw this taxi ID, he mistook it for a sheriff's badge, and he said, "If you're a sheriff, I'm sending you straight to hell."
Oh, no.
Thankfully, he realized that it was just a taxi ID, and he said, "That's the only thing saving your life right now."
Wow.
They took Andrew and his friend George to the back of the car and tied them both up. They tied Andrew's hands in the front of him, and then they tied George's hands behind his back. Andrew said, "If it's the car you're after, just take it. I have a wife and a baby back home." And they just laughed, and one of them said, "You'll see your wife and baby all right." And then another one said, "Be still or I'm going to blow your brains out."
Oh, man.
I mean, they were like really hostile.
Yeah.
Then the 4 men marched Andrew and George down to a thicket by way of a flashlight. When they got down there, someone realized Andrew's hands were tied in front of him, and in so many words said whoever tied him up did a crappy job. So his hands were retied, this time behind his back. Andrew figured that the worst was probably over, that he and George were probably going to be left down there, tied up, while the men stole their car to run the moonshine. He figured they had probably been hiding in the suitcase all along. Andrew heard Petrie talking to George. He said, "I believe we know each other." And he heard George respond and say, "Yeah, I know you." Petrie said to his friends, "Isn't he just a sport?" And then the men gagged George, and then they ended up gagging Andrew as well by putting rags in their mouths. So they couldn't holler, and they could barely breathe.
Right. And I'm thinking, I wish he hadn't have told him that he knew him. You know?
I know.
Oh.
I was trying to figure that out, if he knew him from that night or if he knew him from around town.
Right.
Which was probably the case. Then Andrew heard someone either hit or shoot. He wasn't sure which at the time. Later, he realized that his friend had been hit in the head with the butt of a pistol so hard that he thought it was a shot.
Oh, man, that's awful.
Yeah. And he heard George groan and fall over. And then Andrew was horrified as one of the men bit down and started cutting George's throat.
Oh, no, I hate that.
Andrew could hear the blade tearing his friend's neck, and then he described the next sound as a gurgling sound like running water.
Oh, my goodness. And he has to feel horrible because he's the one that invited him to come along.
And he was paralyzed with fear and, of course, in shock. And there was nothing he could do.
Right.
Then he felt something like a bolt of lightning hit him on the head. He'd been hit with the butt of the gun as well. But Andrew did not lose consciousness. He had the presence of mind to play dead.
Good, good.
But that's when he heard one of the men yell out, "Have you cut his throat yet?"
Oh.
And another of them said, "Not yet, but I'm getting him now."
Oh.
Can you imagine
No.
how horrific it would be to know that you're about to have your throat cut?
No, awful.
So Andrew just started praying, and then it happened. One of those monsters cut his throat. Andrew held his breath and closed his eyes and played dead. Believing he really was dying. Basically, he just lost consciousness for a minute, and then he came to. He was still praying, and he told himself not to stop. He realized that the men at that point were gone. I don't know how he got his hands free, but somehow he did. And he took the rags out of his mouth. He gathered his strength and scooted over to see about his friend. He tried talking to him, but he wasn't responding. He tried reviving him, but it was no use. He had had that
Carotid artery
severed, and his friend was dead. Andrew, knowing there was nothing more he could do for George, had to get out of there, or he had no chance of surviving. He was going to bleed to death.
Right, that's what I was wondering. All this time he is still bleeding.
Yes. So he started off into the night, and he heard the sound of his Chandler 6 in the distance driving away. Andrew wandered around in the dark, disoriented for a long time. He didn't know where he was at. It was pitch dark. And I saw pictures of this location. Even now, it's a desolate place. So I can imagine back then. He actually ran straight into and was cut up really bad by a barbed wire fence.
Oh, man.
He was running through heavy brush that was, cutting through his neck wound. It was terrible. But finally, he sees this farmhouse in the distance. When he approached it and knocked on the door, a man asked, "Hey, what do you want?" But he wouldn't let Andrew in. Andrew tried explaining what had happened, and I'm sure, though, that his story probably sounded unbelievable, and the farmer said he had a sick baby and he couldn't come in.
Oh, well, and I don't know about back then, but now,
yeah,
you can understand that.
I do. He later said, he figured that Andrew was trying to get him to open the door so he could rob him.
Right.
He didn't have a choice but to run back into the night. Then he heard the sound of his car again. So he jumped into some bushes, praying that the men wouldn't see him. He peeked out and could see the car was headed back to the location where he and George had been left.
Oh, and if they see that he's gone, oh goodness.
So he knew that they were going to realize he wasn't there and they were going to be looking for him to finish him off. He was terrified. He took off again, not able to see where he was or where he was going. He fell in over his head into a creek or a river.
My goodness, this guy, honestly, think about it. He's tough as nails.
He is.
He's been hit on the head, right?
Yes.
He's got his throat cut.
Yes.
He's fallen into that barbed wire fence, and now he's fallen into like a river or something.
Yeah, I feel like the barbed wire fence would have took me out.
Yeah, well, yeah.
I would have probably been like, I give up.
Right. Like, you have to have something in you that survivor's instinct. And sometimes I do wonder, I don't think I have it. Like you said.
I know.
At some point, I would have just given up. There's no hope.
Right.
And I would have just laid down.
Oh, my gosh. I just feel for him so much.
Yeah.
So, of course, keeping in mind that he was weak from losing blood.
Yeah.
It was by the grace of God that he was able to get out of that water.
I can't even imagine that he did not drown.
I know. But he climbed out and he continued running and searching for another house. He eventually came up on a school, and thank God a house was on the other side of that school. Now, this time he was afraid to tell the homeowner what had actually happened for fear that they'd turn him away. So he told them that he had been in a car accident. When the man started to turn on the light, Andrew begged him not to. He was terrified.
If they saw
the guys
him.
were going to see him and come up there. And so that's when he told the man the truth about what had really happened to him. He took Andrew inside, and he and his wife tended to him the best that they could. They called the local authorities for help and, of course, to report the crimes.
Good. And I was wondering why the first guy couldn't he not have called for help?
I know. I mean, unless they didn't have a phone, because this was the 20s.
Okay.
When he was safe, Andrew finally collapsed from blood loss, but he was alive.
That's amazing, though, that, again, he held out that long.
Yeah, it really is. Early the next morning, authorities found the battered, bloody body of George Lewis near a gravel quarry on Black Oak Ridge near present-day Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
Oh, I hate that.
They were shocked by the horrific condition of his body and just the senselessness of the crime.
Right. There was no motive to do something like that.
No,
Even if you wanted their car, why do something so brutal?
Well, later they would say dead men tell no tales. But thankfully, live ones do.
Right.
On May 31st, which was the next day, the 4 murdering wannabe bank robbers went on to carry out their plans to rob Oakdale Bank and Trust. Stevens and McClure, carrying the suitcase from the day before, broke into the bank hours before it opened, about 3:30 a.m., so that they could surprise and rob the opening teller before people started coming into the bank, and so their plans wouldn't be thwarted.
Mm-hmm.
Petrie and Christmas hid up the road in the getaway car, waiting for their partners to meet them with the money. When the bank opened up at about 8:30, Stevens and McClure did indeed surprise the opening teller. Wearing disguises, they pulled a gun on him, but the teller recognized Stevens right away.
Where from?
he grew up in the town.
Oh,
this was a
he
small
didn't even go out of
town.
town to rob the bank?
No, and he wore a disguise, but the guy still knew exactly who he was.
Wow.
Idiot. He'd known him since he was a little boy.
Oh, my goodness.
I know. Stevens and McClure didn't realize that there were several men, though, that just happened to come into the bank early that day to cash checks from the railroad. The men realized pretty quick what was going on, and even though Stevens and McClure held the men at gunpoint as they came in, a couple of them ran for it into the street. They alerted the townspeople and set the town alarm.
Oh, I'm so glad.
So Stevens locked the door after the men ran out, but he and McClure had no choice but to run out of the bank, out the back, completely empty-handed.
Mm-hmm. Good.
They ran through the woods and up the hill to a hiding place where Christmas and Petrie were waiting on them. They had to drive back by the bank.
Oh, my goodness.
And make their getaway. These townspeople, they were getting in their cars. They were,
Looking for 'em,
forming
I'm
a
sure.
posse and going right after them. They did have a high-powered vehicle.
Yeah.
And these other cars, they weren't able to catch up to him. But these other posses now from the surrounding towns were also on their tail from these surrounding counties. And the criminals, of course, they're driving fast and erratic, desperately trying to escape. They ended up wrecking the car.
Oh, good.
So they had to take off on foot into the Tennessee hills, which probably was no easy
feat.
Petrie and McClure had hid in a culvert where they were soon found by Chief of Police Roberts and some other armed citizens. The two refused to come out, and so the men went in and took the prisoners by force. Chief Roberts was determined to catch the other two fugitives as well. He had bloodhounds and hundreds of men out there combing the hills. Most thought that the other two must have escaped. Days were turning into weeks at this point. They thought that they must have caught a train and gotten out of there. But Roberts always maintained he believed they were right there. They just had to keep looking. And at about 10:30 p.m. on June 14th, some 3 weeks later, Tom Christmas and Otto Stevens were captured with the help of Tom Christmas's brother, who led Christmas to believe that he was coming in with a vehicle and was going to help him and Stevens escape. But instead, the sheriff and his men stopped the car on the way out and took them into custody without incident.
I'm so glad. Well, way to go for his brother.
Yeah, it was his mother who came up with the plan to help the police capture her own son.
Wow.
She did this because she loved her son.
Sure.
And she was terrified that he was going to be killed in a shootout or by vigilante justice. Also, she was afraid some law enforcement might be killed while trying to make an arrest.
Good for her, though, because, we have talked about several mothers who have just aided their sons in their crimes and that kind of thing. So good for her.
Yeah.
And I'm also glad to hear that they stuck with it for over 3 weeks.
I know.
And didn't just say, okay, well, we can't find them and let it go.
Right. They were dangerous. Other people would have been killed for sure.
Yep.
Christmas's mother did say that she had never believed he had been the one to commit the actual murder or attempted murder. But she did say that all she asked for was for her son to have a fair trial with an unbiased jury. That's fair enough.
Yeah.
The trial for the boys began on July 18th, and they were boys. Like I said, they were in their 20s. I want to show you pictures of them. It actually breaks my heart. They're young, good-looking, stupid boys.
Who haven't really even had the experience to become hardened and cynical and violent, but yet here we are.
So their trial began on July 18th. All four were tried together for the attempted murder of Andrew Crowley and for the first-degree murder of George Lewis. Okay, so we know that only one or two of them actually committed the murder and attempted murder, but I was thinking about that federal law that allows anyone to be charged with murder if someone is killed during the commission of a violent felony, and they all four committed a violent felony by kidnapping, stealing a car, and armed robbery.
Yeah. Did you know, have I told you that Tim's cousin was the getaway driver in a robbery?
You did.
And a guy got killed. And he says he didn't know they were going to kill the guy but the guy did get killed. And so they all four, he did get charged and convicted of that and did time in prison for it.
Yeah. So their trial began on July 18th. The men's defense lawyers tried to have their trial separated, but the judge refused. Charlie Petrie, the youngest of the group, 22 years old, looked shockingly young. He could have been one of my own son's friends. He was short, literally a kid. He came from a respected family in Clinton. His mother begged the court to take her son's mental capacity into consideration. She said that he'd been hit in the head as a boy and hadn't been right since. But I read a lot of witness testimony, and even from the doctors, from friends, from people that he had worked for, and I'm not really sure that was true. I think she was probably trying to save her son's life.
He had been hit in the head, but you don't know if.
I don't even know if he was hit in the head.
Okay.
I mean, maybe. He may have been. I don't want to say she was lying, but she had said that he had fits. There was just no evidence of any of that.
Okay. I do know a guy who has epileptic seizures. His mental capacity is very young. He's mentally delayed.
Right.
And his mom has told Tim that he was fine as a kid until a lady in the lunchroom hit him on the head with a lunch tray. And she says that he was not the same after that.
Really?
And he's got the mind of a young child. Sweetest thing. But she says that it messed up his brain, and he does have seizures.
Wow.
So
okay. I mean, so it is very possible. She maintains that was true. People that he had worked for, they said that, they felt like he could read good. He could do math very well. It seemed like when he was there, he was a good worker.
Yeah.
He didn't always show up.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I really feel like he was young and mature, and he was rebellious. A pack runner. I think he was impressionable. All these guys were...
peer pressure.
Yeah. And he was really short. And I just noticed, listening to the testimony of the victim, he was the loudest.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean?
So he's trying to prove himself, maybe?
I really do believe that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there is something to be said for falling in with the wrong crowd.
The judge refused the mother's request. I believe had he been found incompetent, even by reason of insanity, he would have been killed by a lynch mob.
Oh, okay.
Definitely believe that. John McClure was a 26-year-old barber who was from Columbus, Ohio, deeply loved by his parents and his beautiful sweetheart. Her name was Grace. His mother moved to Tennessee to be close to her son. All of these guys, they were loved.
But why would he do such a thing?
I have no idea. I mean, money?
Yeah, but...
The love of money, the root of all evil.
Yeah.
So 3 of the men blamed Otto Stevens, which was the one that was recognized in the bank. They blamed him for the actual murder of George Lewis and for the attempted murder of Andrew. But they were all blaming each other. None of them were taking any responsibility.
Of course.
But I do believe that he was the one who cut George Lewis's throat, the actual murder, because a jailer in Knox County named Earl Hall went on the stand and testified that Stevens had confessed that he had been the one who had murdered Lewis. He said that he'd take what was coming to him and expected that it would be the death penalty. Stevens also told Hall who cut Crumley's throat, but it was ruled as inadmissible, and the court would not allow him to say who it was.
Unfortunately, it does happen. Sometimes things cannot be admissible, even though it's really good evidence.
Yeah, and he says that he did not cut Crumley's throat, and I believe that as well. I don't think he did both. Other officers testified that McClure gave a partial confession. Christmas, he was a young, handsome, once promising electrician.
Wow.
When he was first arrested, he had said he had no idea that his friends were planning to kill Lewis and Crumley, and that he had tried to stop them and told them they had gone too far, but he wasn't believed, and he eventually just stopped talking altogether. So far they've got 2 of them that are given kind of confessions. Christmas, who's clammed up, and then Petrie, the youngest, who we know for sure was the loudest, but he denied having anything at all the whole time to do with the actual murders. But Crumley, who survived, He had suspected that Petrie had been the one to cut his throat. And this was just speculation. He was not sure. His eyes were closed and he didn't hear the guy talking who cut his throat. But the reason he thought this was he just kind of came up with this theory. When they were marching the two down the hill to the thicket, he heard Petrie say, "I'm really nervous about doing this, but I'll get used to it." Crumley believed that whoever had cut his throat had been the weakest and had been nervous about doing it because they did not sever his arteries.
Right. That artery is actually really close to the surface of the skin. You do not have to cut deeply to get that.
So Crumley did not believe that Stevens had cut his throat because he thought that if he had, he would not have survived.
He would have finished the job.
And that was just his theory, but it's a pretty decent one.
I think it's a pretty good theory. I think Crumley's a pretty smart guy.
I think so too. The prosecution's main witness, of course, was Andrew Crumley, the victim whose throat had been cut by one of the men and left for dead by all of them. And as you can imagine, his testimony was compelling and heart-wrenching. He said he'd experienced more terror that night than most men would in an entire lifetime.
Yeah.
He spoke about being in World War I and some of the bloodiest battles, but how it had not compared to the terror of that night. His hands still shook. He was still nervous. He was clearly suffering, PTSD.
Absolutely.
And I believe he did for the rest of his life.
I'm sure he probably did.
The boys' mothers pled for mercy for their sons. Charles Petrie and Otto Stevens' mothers even visited Andrew Crumley at his home. We don't know the nature of their conversation because when asked about it by a reporter, Andrew said he was not going to parade the mother's sorrows and embarrass them.
Oh, he's a good guy.
He is such a good guy. He said that he had tremendous compassion for the women and that he felt so sorry for the mothers, but that their sons had no pity for him or for his friend George Lewis.
And that's, exactly right.
When all was said and done, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts for all four of the men. Charles Petrie, Otto Stevens, Tom Christmas, and John McClure were sentenced to death by electrocution.
Wow. And, I think that was a good decision. I hate it. And I do agree with him about those moms. I'm sure that they felt that, but still.
Heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking, but that is what they deserve.
Yeah. Petrie, who had not really shown any emotion throughout the entire trial, when he saw his mother break down and cry, sobbed into his own hands.
Oh, that is really sad.
Otto Stevens, who the prosecution had nicknamed the Butcher, picked up his frail mother's body and laid her on a bench and kissed and fanned her face because she had passed out when the guilty verdict was read.
Wow.
Their families were distraught and they were heartbroken. The men were sent to Nashville to wait for their sentences to be carried out. They appealed, and the judge did agree that there had been problems with the trial, but the evidence was overwhelming.
The testimony of Crumley alone was very damning evidence.
It was, and so he upheld the sentences. Not one of the men confessed to the murders. Now, Stevens supposedly did to the jailer, but he had never gave an official confession. Now, they all admitted to being there. I mean, they couldn't really deny that. But none of them confessed to the actual murder or the attempted murder.
But didn't three of them say that Stevens had been the one?
Yes, but they blamed him for both. He did do one, but nobody believed that he did both.
Yeah. Okay.
The boys had advocates who worked very hard to try to get them a stay of execution, but it wasn't looking good. The Knox County jailer, Earl Hall, who had testified for the prosecution about Otto Stevens' confession, he had spent a lot of time with the boys. And after they were sent to Nashville to the death house, he wrote each of them a letter advising them to prepare their souls to die so that if they weren't granted a stay of execution, their families would have the peace of knowing that they were prepared to meet God. He told them that it would give them peace in their own hearts to know that they were ready to. Charles Petrie responded, "Dear Earl, I received your letter yesterday Was glad to hear from you, Earl. Also glad to know you were interested in our soul's welfare. You and Bill treated us as nice as you could. When a man treats me like a man in a place like that, I never forget it. How is old Bill? Well, Earl, if I don't see you anymore in this old world, I'm a pretty good fella anyhow. All the boys are okay. Sincerely, Charlie Petrie.
Oh, man.
Otto Stevens' response was, this is the one who he had said confessed to him. Mr. Earl Hall, dear sir, I wish to thank you for your consideration, kindness, and favors. Would like to write a longer letter, but as I am not at all well, I will have to be brief. I am trusting in my heavenly Father. I'm sorry of my former continued ignorance of him. I have some hope, but if nothing is done to right this injustice, I will go, I think, to rest quietly. Sincerely yours, Otto Stevens. Christmas wrote to the jailer, Dear Earl Hall, dear friend, I received your letter today. Pleased to hear from you. Your advice is accepted and is good, but I'm still in hopes and will be to the last. Yours sincerely, Tom Christmas. And then McClure did not respond. Stevens, Christmas, and McClure all sent affidavits to the governor, to Governor Taylor, claiming that the youngest of them, 22-year-old Charlie Petrie, had nothing to do with the actual murder. They said that he was out of his mind drunk in the car the whole time. I'm not sure why they sent that, if they were really trying to save his life, if they felt sorry for him, or if they were just trying to delay the execution. But what they said goes completely against what Andrew Crumley said.
And I'm going to believe Crumley.
Yeah. He's mentioned Petrie several times. Do you remember he had told Andrew he'd send him straight to hell if he was a sheriff?
Mm-hmm. And he said that's the one that said that to him.
And he also said that he's the one that asked George, I believe you know me.
Yeah.
All that was Petrie.
Well, I'm believing Crumley's account of that.
Me too. They were scheduled to be executed on a Wednesday. That Tuesday, they were in their cells, hoping with all that they had, they would hear from the governor for a stay of execution. Charlie Petrie smoked cigarettes, visited with his mother and sister, and read the Blue Book, which was a best-selling pulp fiction magazine in the 1920s. Otto Stevens found consolation in his prayers and in his mother. John McClure enjoyed visiting with his dad from Pennsylvania. Tom Christmas spent his time visiting with his mother and reading the book of Matthew. He told a reporter that to execute a man was to execute a man's mother. His mother had been by his side throughout everything. His dad had died when he was just a little boy. He told reporters that he never had believed in capital punishment. He said God hadn't made any such laws, and we're supposed to live under his laws. And his law says, thou shalt not kill. I find that ironic.
It is ironic.
Christmas said he believed Governor Taylor had a heart. If the governor would just read a few verses of Matthew, it would help him so much. Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you that you resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. I feel like he should have been reading that before they murdered George Lewis and tried to murder Andrew Crumley.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting that he is placing the blame for his mother's pain on everybody but himself.
Exactly.
And he is the one to blame.
He is. So he is not taking any responsibility.
No. And in her testimony, she admitted that she'd had trouble with him for a long time.
He's clearly not remorseful.
No.
And
his mother blamed their circumstances and the death of his father. I guess they had been wealthy. His father died, and then he had to go to work, wasn't able to get a good education. But you know what? So did his brother.
Yeah.
And his brother turned out good and not to be a criminal.
He still made that life choice.
Then Christmas wrote a letter to his brother, basically telling him he didn't blame him for being put to death. He wrote that he knew that he and their mother had been fooled by the police chief Roberts, and now he was going to have to give his life for it.
No, you're giving your life for your crime of murder. And
he wrote not to worry or to blame himself, that God would avenge all his enemies and that Chief Roberts was one of his enemies.
Oh, goodness. I hope he's the first one they take.
He went on to write that Christ said vengeance was his, and he meant it. That all the people who wanted him to be put to death are guilty of murder in their hearts, and that's just the same as if they had killed a man.
I honestly cannot stand it when people who are obviously not walking after the words of the Bible try to use it to defend themselves or to back up a position when they clearly don't know what it actually says. Not that he's wrong that it says that. We do know that God has set up those laws for individuals, but when it comes to a government, that the government does bear the responsibility of governing and judging people and dishing out justice for crimes on this side.
That's exactly right. He wrote that God is not like we are, that he is merciful if we come to him the right way, and he assured his brother that he was going to try to do it in that way. Finally, Christmas wrote that he held nothing against no one, and that he hopes no one held anything against him. All of his empathy is for himself. I did not detect 1 ounce of remorse or empathy for their victims.
No.
Really from any of them. I mean, honestly, the only one that I detected a teeny weeny bit of sympathy from or sorrow was the one that I believe actually committed the murder. And that was Stevens. I think he had a lot of regrets. I think he saw the error of his ways from a long time ago.
Yeah.
And he just said several times, I know I'm probably going to die for this, and I should. I guess up until a certain age, though, everything is everybody else's fault.
Yeah, and I guess different people mature into that understanding at different ages.
Yeah.
So you would think by 26.
You would think. These boys lived, they were not responsible. None of them. I really they were all maybe a little spoiled.
Yeah. It kind of sounded like that at the beginning, actually.
But that lack of empathy, that's what gets me. Friends, family, priests, and pastors all came to comfort the condemned men in their final hours. They smoked cigarettes. They ate candy and fruit and a last meal of their choosing. McClure's dad stayed with him until late Tuesday night, saying goodbye to his son and doing his best to comfort him. His beautiful girlfriend, Grace Brown, also stayed with him as long as she could. He wrote her a final poem to read after he was gone and gave her a ring. Grace sobbed as she said her goodbyes. The boys all wrote letters, read their Bible, and seemed at peace with their fate, but none admitted to the murder or the attempted murder.
That just makes me aggravated.
I think they were still hoping for a stay of execution.
Oh, yeah, probably.
At the last, Petrie got sick and was suddenly struck with terror. Prison officials mercifully decided that he would go first. To literally put him out of his misery, he was terrified. They figured if they didn't, that they wouldn't even be able to seat him. I mean, it was that bad. He was sat down into the electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky, and was pronounced dead at 6:15 a.m. on Wednesday morning. The others were just down the hall, hearing the sounds of their friends being electrocuted.
Wow.
Now, knowing
that would be scary, but you know what? So was Andrew Crumley when he was sitting there with his eyes closed playing dead, knowing somebody was going to come and cut his throat.
That's right. And not having a chance. George didn't have a chance to say goodbye to his family.
No.
Time to say any last words like these guys were all getting to do. Right. So Tom Christmas was taken second, and 10 minutes after Petrie, he was pronounced dead at 6:25. Stevens was next to die at 6:35. And finally, McClure was dead at 6:45. Just like that, the 4 men who committed one of the most brutal, senseless murders in the state of Tennessee at the time had paid for their crimes with their lives. The wages of sin is death.
Absolutely.
If you ever visit Pigeon Forge, there's an Alcatraz museum. My brother actually took me and Mom and Memphis and Lily there a few years ago. Anyway, Old Sparky, the chair that these guys were electrocuted in, is on display there, along with lots of other fascinating true crime memorabilia. So if you get a chance to go, You can see old Sparky.
How about that? I've never been to Pigeon Forge.
Okay.
Never. And so I'm going to put that on my list of.
They had John Wayne Gacy's one of his clown costumes.
Oh, that's creepy.
They had like a lot of crazy stuff there.
And what museum is called what?
The Alcatraz Museum.
Alcatraz Museum. Okay, yeah, I definitely want to go there. Wow, those were some hard times.
They sure were.
With the holiday season over, we're jumping into tax season. And what better reason to download every episode of Hard Times and True Crimes than an ever-growing list of creative ways to deal with the IRS. You can chop them, mash them, set them on fire, run them over with a car, or you could use a more creative idea, like making an elaborate plan to have them kidnapped and tortured so you can come in and save the day. Only don't. Take a nap instead. And if you mention Hard Times and True Crimes at your arraignment, we'll guarantee to do an episode all about you. So you make sure you tell everybody you know, and a few people you don't, even if they work for the IRS, to check us out. Till next time, goodbye.